Matthew Whitfield, the quietly confident CEO of a successful international airline, decided to observe his company's service from a different perspective. On this particular day, he dressed in a simple outfit, scuffed shoes, worn jeans, and a travel-weary jacket, aiming to blend in as an ordinary passenger. Dorothy Thompson was a flight attendant known for her efficiency, but also her growing resentment from years of frustrations on the job. Eleanor Price, her coworker, tried to see the good in people, diffusing tensions with kindness wherever she could. Glenn Walter, the new pilot, had his own insecurities about whether he truly belonged in the cockpit. Carmen Hernandez, a passenger with an unshakable determination, was on a personal journey that was deeper than the flight itself. Matthew was about to board a flight from New York to Zurich, intending to see firsthand how employees treated passengers at all levels. Though he technically owned the planes, he wanted to experience the journey as just another traveler, unnoticed and unassuming. He was accustomed to managing multi-billion-dollar deals, but never lost sight of how small customer service details could shape an airline's reputation. As he approached the gate, Dorothy had just finished a tense phone call with her older brother, who was asking for money again. Her eyes were heavy with frustration. She was proud to be the first in her family to hold a steady job, but she resented being treated like a financial safety net for everyone around her. Her schedule had been changed at the last minute, forcing her to work this Zurich flight. Seeing the departing gate monitors, she felt a rush of disdain. A recent incident where a passenger insulted her accent still stung. Even though Dorothy spoke flawless English, the subtle comments about her voice from others still hurt. Matthew, carrying a modest carry-on bag, approached the early boarding checkpoint with a battered first-class ticket. Dorothy immediately noticed him. His appearance didn't match the typical first-class traveler. He looked more like he had just stepped off a budget bus than a business jet. She decided to challenge him. "Sir, first-class passengers only," she said firmly, standing tall as if her uniform gave her ultimate authority. Matthew calmly showed her his ticket. "I believe this is the right line." She eyed the ticket skeptically. "The main cabin is over there." She pointed toward the economy line. "I'm in the right place," Matthew said, keeping his voice steady. Dorothy hesitated and then, loud enough for those around them to hear, asked, "Did you buy it yourself, or was it some sort of last-minute upgrade?" Matthew felt the gaze of others on him but decided to remain quiet and observe her actions. "I'm here on business, and I always pay for first class." Dorothy scrutinized him, her irritation rising from previous experiences with passengers trying to sneak into first class. "Let me scan your ticket," she said, grabbing it roughly. When the scan confirmed it was valid, she begrudgingly stepped aside. "Enjoy your flight," she muttered, a forced smile on her face. As Matthew boarded, he noticed the subtle tension in the air, with a few curious stares from other first-class passengers. Dorothy had already passed by, making sure everything was in order, but Matthew couldn't help but notice how she gave preferential treatment to the more typical business travelers. After takeoff, Dorothy handed out hot towels to first-class passengers. Matthew's was barely warm, while others received fresh, steamy towels. He silently accepted it, but the difference was clear. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, a child started crying, and Dorothy muttered under her breath, "They can't even keep that kid quiet." Matthew overheard but kept quiet, taking mental notes on her behavior. Back in the cockpit, Glenn Walter, the new pilot, felt the pressure of his first official flight as captain. His heart raced as he made the standard announcements, but the responsibility of being in the cockpit weighed heavily on him. Dorothy's service continued, with more subtle signs of inequality in her interactions. She handed Carmen Hernandez, a young woman in a hoodie, her orange juice with little more than a nod. However, when she served a well-dressed businessman, her smile was warm and gracious. Matthew noticed it all. He knew he was on an undercover mission, and these biases were part of what he needed to observe. Carmen, despite feeling out of place, eventually relaxed when Matthew offered her a friendly word. Meanwhile, Dorothy grew more annoyed at the potential alliance between the two out-of-place passengers in first class. Matthew continued to observe, taking in every detail, from the blankets given out to the difference in the way people were treated. He could see the subtle disparities, thinner blankets for certain passengers and thicker ones for others. As the flight continued, Dorothy's frustration seemed to mount. She became increasingly curt with passengers she deemed unworthy of the first-class experience. When an older man in the last row of first class had trouble with his tray table, Dorothy sighed impatiently and yanked it free without even acknowledging him. Matthew, observing all of this, knew he had to stay patient. The day was far from over. Later, as the flight leveled out, Matthew walked toward the galley, passing Dorothy as she pressed her fingertips to her temples, clearly exhausted. He thought about revealing his identity, but it wasn't the right time. Instead, he nodded politely, and she gave him a brief, curt response. He returned to his seat and noticed yet another inconsistency. His blanket was far too thin for first-class standards. Carmen, on the other hand, had a much thicker one. The subtle differences in service were becoming undeniable. As the flight continued, Matthew realized that this was more than just about one flight. It was about the culture he needed to change within his airline. Matthew felt the tension building with each passing moment. His mind churned with thoughts of how best to approach Dorothy and whether he should reveal himself as the CEO of the airline. He knew it would shock her and likely bring some uncomfortable truths to the surface. But part of him wondered if it was necessary to confront her now, or if he should continue observing and gathering more information. He didn't want to risk damaging any chances of meaningful change by coming down too hard on one individual, even if she was the embodiment of many of the biases he'd been concerned about. Meanwhile, as the plane descended toward Zurich, the weight of the different lives on board seemed more apparent than ever. There was Glenn, struggling to calm his nerves as he prepared for his first big landing as captain. There was Eleanor, quietly making a difference with her warmth and patience. And then there was Dorothy, her struggle so personal, yet so intertwined with her interactions on the job. The flight began its final approach, and the calmness of the cabin seemed to echo the quiet determination Matthew felt within. He glanced around again, his gaze lingering on the passengers, including Carmen, who had settled in more comfortably as the flight went on. He could see the contrast between her nervousness when boarding and the ease she had found by the end of the flight. It reminded him why he had to pursue this mission, to create an airline culture where all passengers felt valued, no matter their background, appearance, or status. As the wheels touched down and the cabin jolted, a sense of finality settled over the passengers. The tension that had quietly simmered throughout the flight finally came to a head. Matthew stood, ready to disembark, and as he collected his things, he felt an unexpected sense of anticipation. Would Dorothy's guarded, brittle demeanor crack? Would she show any sign of remorse for the way she had treated certain passengers? Just before he reached the exit, he caught a glimpse of Dorothy again, her eyes briefly meeting his. This time, there was something different in her expression, a flicker of realization. Matthew wasn't sure if it was recognition or just an acknowledgement of the oddity of the whole situation, but he felt the weight of it. He could no longer be the anonymous observer. He made his way toward the front of the plane, the final pieces of the puzzle in place. He had seen enough to know that change needed to happen, not just in the way passengers were treated, but in the culture that fueled those interactions. As he stepped off the plane, he was resolved. It was time to take action, and while the flight was over, this journey of transformation had only just begun. Dorothy took the card from Matthew's hand, her fingers trembling slightly as she stared at it. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, her thoughts swirling between shame and relief. The walls she had carefully built around herself began to crack, not because of Matthew's confrontation, but because of his unexpected kindness. She had anticipated judgment, maybe even reprimands, but instead she found an opportunity to get help, to change. She started, but the words stuck in her throat. She wasn't used to this kind of compassion, and it made her feel both vulnerable and exposed. Matthew gave her a quiet, understanding smile. I know it might seem like a lot, but you don't have to handle everything on your own. People go through tough times, and sometimes it's hard to know where to turn. Just remember that you're not alone in this. Dorothy nodded slowly. The initial anger and defensiveness she had felt slowly ebbing away. Her eyes flickered to Eleanor, who had been watching from a distance, giving them space. Eleanor's gaze held concern, but there was no judgment in it, just quiet support. Thank you, Dorothy said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a grand gesture, but for her it felt like a huge step. I didn't think anyone would care about what I'm going through. I've been too focused on just surviving. Matthew gave her a soft nod, his expression sincere. Everyone has their battles. Just remember, how we treat others isn't just about following policies. It's about seeing people for who they are, not what we assume them to be. She let out a shaky breath. The tears she'd fought to hold back earlier now threatening to fall. For a moment, she just stood there, processing everything. Eleanor moved closer then, her presence a quiet comfort. Dorothy gave a small smile, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes as she turned to Eleanor. Maybe it's time I looked into those resources, she said, her voice still uncertain but with a glimmer of hope. Eleanor smiled gently. It's never too late, Dorothy. As Matthew turned to leave, he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing he had planted a seed for change, not just in the way employees treated passengers, but in how they viewed themselves and the support available to them. He couldn't fix everything overnight, but he could make sure the airline was a place where people were given the tools to grow, both professionally and personally. He paused at the exit, glancing back at Dorothy, who was standing a little taller now, her shoulders less burdened, her demeanor a touch softer. Maybe, just maybe, this encounter would lead to more than just a conversation. It could lead to change. With that thought in mind, he walked toward the terminal, ready to tackle the next chapter of his journey, confident that small acts of kindness could lead to big transformations. And grow. She knew it would take time. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like the pieces were starting to come together. She wasn't just stuck in a loop of resentment and frustration anymore. She had a sense of purpose, a chance to make real change, both in her personal life and her work life. As Dorothy sat there sipping her cappuccino, she thought about how Matthew's unexpected kindness had changed her perspective. He hadn't just confronted her behavior. He had extended an olive branch, showing her that growth was possible without judgment. It reminded her of the importance of seeing people for who they really were, not just as they appeared in a moment of stress or discomfort. She pulled out her phone and looked at the email from Matthew again. Thank you for reaching out. I'm glad you're taking steps toward change. It felt like a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. Maybe there was hope for her after all. Maybe she could start to rebuild the trust she had lost, not just with others, but with herself. As she left the coffee shop, the crisp morning air seemed fresher, more inviting. She could already feel the change in her step, a lightness she hadn't experienced in ages. Dorothy wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she had the tools to face it. The path wouldn't be easy, but at least now she felt ready to walk it. Meanwhile, Matthew was already planning his next steps. He had seen the potential for change in the small actions of his team, and he wanted to build on it. He wasn't just focusing on improving performance metrics or profits. He was focused on the people, the ones who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, whose struggles often went unnoticed. He knew that by creating a culture of empathy and support, his employees would rise to new heights, both professionally and personally. In the quiet of the early morning, Matthew drafted another note, this time to the HR department, outlining his vision for a more supportive, inclusive workplace. As he typed, he reflected on his undercover journey, recognizing that real leadership wasn't about power or status. It was about listening, understanding, and helping others grow. For Matthew, it was a new beginning. For Dorothy, it was the start of something just as important, finding her way back to herself. And in the end, both of them would carry this journey with them. A reminder that growth came not from perfection, but from the courage to change. The airline would be stronger because of it. The people, both behind the counter and in the sky, would be stronger too. And as Dorothy set her pen down and looked at her goals for the future, she realized that the hardest part was over. She had taken the first step toward becoming the person she wanted to be. And that was enough for now. She knew she had to start by changing herself. After a deep breath, she jotted it down. That same day, Matthew was receiving calls from department heads, all asking about the rumors surrounding his mysterious flight. Whispers spread that he'd nearly been stopped by a flight attendant from entering first class. Matthew kept the details to himself, praising the pilot and highlighting the positive aspects of the service. A director asked Matthew if it was true that a flight attendant had disrespected him. Matthew chuckled, replying, "Let's just say it was a lesson for both of us." He preferred teaching over punishing. Meanwhile, Dorothy on another flight was actively applying her resolutions. She treated passengers with kindness, no longer judging by appearances. When faced with rude passengers, she kept her composure and worked on strategies for better handling such situations. Glenn, noticing the change in cabin dynamics, silently credited himself for maintaining a calm cockpit environment. In therapy, Dorothy discovered how past struggles had impacted her self-esteem. She learned to separate the actions of rude passengers from her worth, slowly opening up to others. Matthew, hearing about her progress, launched a program to encourage empathy across the airline. Dorothy received a heartfelt message from a coworker praising her for handling a delay calmly, and it moved her deeply. She set firmer boundaries with her family, allowing herself to focus more on her own life. Carmen, inspired by Matthew's advice during a flight, applied for a promotion and got the job. She shared her story online, thanking the kind stranger who had sparked her confidence. Eventually, Matthew, Dorothy, and Eleanor found themselves on the same flight again, this time by design. Matthew boarded in a suit, and Dorothy greeted him with a warm smile, no longer feeling nervous. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Whitfield," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him board. He paused and nodded. "Likewise. Good to see you're still with us." As he glanced around the cabin, he noticed the calm and orderly atmosphere. "How are things going?" he asked. "A lot better, thanks. I appreciate the chance to improve," she replied, her voice steady. He smiled. "Keep it up." As he made his way to his seat, he caught Eleanor's eye. She beamed at him as if to say, "Look at us now." Dorothy performed her duties with newfound calm and authority. When she did the first-class beverage service, she offered Matthew the same courtesy she gave every passenger, whether they wore suits or sweatpants. Later, Eleanor approached him. "I wanted to thank you. Dorothy's turned over a new leaf, and our work environment is so much better." He glanced at Dorothy, who was serving another row. "It looks that way." Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "It means a lot that you didn't just fire her. You saw she needed help." Matthew smiled. "Everyone deserves a second chance, as long as they're willing to put in the work." He sipped the water she'd brought him. It tasted good, perhaps because he was savoring the moment of real change. Dorothy noticed Matthew and Eleanor talking, a moment of apprehension rising in her. But she steadied herself. She finished her tasks, and when the right moment came, she approached him. "Is there anything else I can get you, sir?" He shook his head. "I'm all set. I just want you to know I'm proud of your progress." She looked down, a small smile forming. Thank you. The rest of the flight was smooth, with Dorothy extending small acts of kindness to passengers. She even offered an older woman a seat in business class when a mechanical glitch forced seat reassignments. The positive energy spread through the crew, and when the plane landed, Dorothy directed passengers with calm efficiency. Later, as Matthew prepared to leave the aircraft, Dorothy caught a brief moment to speak with him. I heard from HR about possibly helping with some new training modules. I'm thinking of volunteering for a mentorship program, she said. Matthew's smile deepened. That's excellent. I think you'd do great. She nodded. Thank you. It means a lot to hear you say that. As he walked away, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. His undercover time had revealed some harsh truths, but it had sparked meaningful change. Looking back at the planes on the tarmac, he reflected on how a single flight had set in motion a series of transformations. Months passed, and Dorothy continued to grow. Her family issues were better managed, her finances more secure, and her self-worth no longer dependent on passenger approval. She now greeted every traveler with genuine warmth, her accent no longer something to hide, but a bridge between her and the diverse passengers she served. At a staff appreciation event, Matthew delivered a speech. Afterward, Dorothy found him, waiting for others to finish speaking with him. She approached cautiously. "Hello, Mr. Whitfield," she said. He smiled warmly. "Good to see you, Dorothy. I've been hearing good things. I just wanted to say, if you ever do another undercover flight, you might see a very different side of me." He smiled, nodding. "I look forward to it. You know, people talk about second chances, but it's your own effort that made the difference. Never forget that." She grinned. "I won't. Thank you again." She extended her hand and he shook it firmly.